was sitting on my living room couch, staring at the TV without really paying attention, when my phone vibrated. It was a text from Lisa, my childhood friend. We hadn't talked much lately, but that message hit me like a punch in the gut. "I need to see you. I'm not okay." Those words kept echoing in my head. Lisa had always been one of the strongest people I knew, so if she was asking for help, things were serious. Without thinking twice, I threw some clothes in a backpack, grabbed my car keys, and left the house. The plan was to drive to her town, but the GPS gave me an alternative: take a train that was leaving from the nearest station in half an hour. Since it was late and I was exhausted, I decided taking the train would be safer. I was too worried to drive. I got to the station just before the train was about to leave. The platform was almost empty, except for an old man sitting on a bench, staring into space. I bought my ticket and boarded, choosing a car that seemed empty. I settled into a seat by the window and watched the scenery start to blur as the train picked up speed. It was night, and the darkness outside was only broken by small dots of light from distant houses and streetlights. I was tired, but I couldn't sleep. The worry about Lisa wouldn't let me relax. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. My phone battery was almost dead, and I didn't have a charger. I had forgotten to grab one in my rush to leave the house. I sighed, trying to shake off the bad feeling that was creeping up on me. As the train moved on, the lights inside the car started flickering. No big deal, I thought. Old trains always have these kinds of issues. But within seconds, everything went completely dark. I stayed still, waiting for the power to come back on, but the silence and the darkness were absolute. I looked out the window and saw we were in the middle of a forest. Tall, dense trees stretched as far as I could see, casting strange shadows under the faint moonlight. Suddenly, the train stopped abruptly, like it had hit something, but there was no sound of impact. Just the screech of the brakes and then complete silence again. My eyes tried to adjust to the darkness, and my heart started pounding harder. Something was wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your spine tingle just thinking about it. I sat there, waiting for someone to make an announcement, but nothing happened. The train remained still, drowned in a terrifying silence. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight, but the battery had died. I was completely in the dark, both literally and figuratively. The train, stuck in the middle of nowhere, pitch black and nearly empty, felt like the perfect setup for a horror movie. I couldn't help but think about that as I sat there, waiting. That's when I heard footsteps. Heavy, dragging steps, like someone was walking down the aisle. But I was sure I'd been the only one there until now. The footsteps kept getting closer, closer. I held my breath, trying to listen more carefully. The steps stopped right next to my seat. My heart was about to burst out of my chest. I tried to gather the courage to stand up and see what was happening, but before I could do anything, the lights flickered back on. The train started moving again, smoothly, as if nothing had happened. I looked around, breathing heavily, but I didn't see anyone. The aisle was empty, and I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or the worry about Lisa messing with my head. But when I looked toward the back of the car, I saw something that froze me with fear. Sitting a few rows behind me was a man. He hadn't been there before, I was sure of it, and he was staring at me, unblinking, with a gaze that seemed to pierce straight through me. The car was completely silent, except for the rhythmic sound of the wheels on the tracks. But that man who shouldn't have been there, he kept staring at me, and I couldn't look away. It was as if his eyes had some kind of power over me, holding me in place. He was tall, with extremely pale, almost corpse-like skin. He wore an old-fashioned black suit, like something from another time. But what disturbed me the most was his expression. It was empty, emotionless, as if he wasn't really human. Something from another world. I tried to stay calm, but my whole body was on high alert. What should I do? Get up and run? Confront him? Sitting there, pretending nothing was happening, seemed like the worst option. But that's what my frozen body chose to do. Finally, he looked away and, without any hurry, stood up. My heart skipped a beat. The man began walking toward the door of the train car, but before leaving, he stopped right beside me. My whole body tensed up. He was so close that I could feel the cold air around him. Without saying a word, he turned and moved to the next car, disappearing through the door. I didn't know what to do. Everything inside me screamed not to follow him, but at the same time, there was a part of me that was curious, a part that needed to know more. So, against my better judgment, I stood up and started walking in the direction he went. Following that mysterious figure was crazy, I know, but I couldn't help it. The next car was as empty as mine. The only difference was that the lights here seemed dimmer, flickering every now and then. The man was nowhere to be seen. I kept walking, passing through another car and then another, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. With each car I passed, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Something was deeply wrong here, something I couldn't explain. But before I could turn back, the train stopped again, just as abruptly as before. This time, the lights didn't go out, but the silence that followed was even more disturbing. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The train was stopped, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the same dark forest from before. And then I saw him again. The man. He was outside, in the forest, standing among the trees, staring straight at me. How did he get out there? I had no idea, but that gaze, so empty and lifeless, sent a chill down my spine. He didn't move, just stood there, watching. I slowly backed away, moving down the corridor of the car. I wanted to get away from him, but at the same time, I couldn't look away, afraid of what might happen if I lost sight of him. When I finally made it back to my seat, the train started moving again. Speeding up more and more, I looked out the window, and the man was still there, now farther away but still watching me until the trees finally hid him from view. I sank back into my seat, trying to calm my breathing. Something was wrong with this train, and I had a terrible feeling. The train continued its journey through the night, but deep down, I knew I was being taken much farther than my intended destination. The weight of that feeling was almost suffocating. I couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious man. Who was he? And what did he want? Why was he staring at me with those empty eyes? My mind was a mess, and the lack of sleep was starting to get to me. Every sound, every movement of the train made me jump. I felt like I was being watched, even though I was alone in the car. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the train began to slow down again. I looked out the window and saw the station approaching. The small sign announced the name of the town I was heading to. It was a relief to see that I was finally arriving. But when the train stopped and the doors opened, something was wrong. The station was completely deserted. There wasn't a single soul there. The only light came from an old street lamp that flickered, almost going out. I stepped off the train, my legs shaking, and looked around. Everything was shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to swallow the small town. I walked toward the exit of the station, but every step seemed to take me deeper into that feeling of terror. When I finally reached the gate, a cold chill ran down my spine. And then, I saw him again. The man in the black suit, standing at the entrance, as if he had been waiting for me. He didn't move. The man in the black suit was standing there at the entrance to the station, as if he had been waiting for me all along. His empty stare seemed to pierce through my soul, and for a moment, I was frozen in place. What did he want from me? Why was he everywhere I went? Fear gripped me, but I knew I had to keep moving. I had to find Lisa. I had to see if she was okay. But every step toward the man made me question if I was making the right choice. I could hear my heart pounding desperately. The fear gave way to a primal terror, something I had never felt before. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, I felt a pressure in my ears, like something was trying to enter my mind. Suddenly, he moved. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed toward the center of the town, enveloped by the fog. I knew he wanted me to go in that direction, but everything inside me screamed to run the other way. Even so, something beyond my control forced me to move forward. I walked past him, avoiding his gaze, and continued down the main street. The old houses and shops looked abandoned, as if the town had been forgotten by time. The thick fog seemed to swallow me, muffling all sounds except for my own quickened breathing and the echo of my footsteps on the pavement. I arrived at a small square in the center of the town. In the middle of the square, there was an old church, its walls covered in moss and its windows broken. It looked like it had been there for centuries, forgotten. Just like the town, something was drawing me inside, and before I realized it, I was already climbing the steps to the entrance. The wooden door creaked as I opened it, revealing a dark and empty interior. I stepped inside, my heart pounding harder with each step. The silence inside the church was deafening. The darkness felt alive, like it was watching me. I knew Lisa was there, somewhere inside that church. I didn't know how, but I could feel her presence, her desperation. I walked down the central aisle, heading toward the altar. That's when I heard a whisper. "Help me." It was her voice. Lisa was calling for me. I looked around, trying to find where the sound was coming from, but there was no one there. The voice was everywhere, echoing off the walls. "Please help me." The desperation in her voice was palpable, and I ran toward the altar, desperate to find her. But when I reached the end of the aisle, I saw something that made me stop abruptly. On the ground, right in the center of the altar, was a small old photo. It was a childhood photo of me and Lisa, taken many years ago. But something was wrong. I didn't remember this photo, and as I picked it up, a cold chill ran down my spine. When I turned the photo over, I saw a message written by hand, in handwriting I didn't recognize. "She's with him. Save her." Terror completely overwhelmed me. I looked around, but the church was empty, silent, except for my heavy breathing. Who was him? The man in the black suit? What had he done with Lisa? That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, dragging, like the ones I'd heard before on the train. They were coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned around and saw the dark figure of the man in the black suit, standing at the entrance of the church. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching. Fear consumed me. I knew, somehow, that he was the key to all of this, but I had no idea how to face him. And then, before I could react, he started walking toward me. Every step he took seemed to suck the air out of the room, making it heavier and harder to breathe. He got closer until he was just inches away from me. His eyes, empty and lifeless, stared at me with an intensity that made me feel like I was sinking into an abyss. And then he spoke, his voice low and resonant, echoing through the empty church. "You came to the wrong place." Before I could respond, the darkness around us seemed to come alive, engulfing everything. I lost all sense of time and space, and in the blink of an eye, everything vanished. I woke up lying on the station platform. The train was no longer there. Morning was breaking, the faint light of the sun illuminating the town. There was no sign of the fog, the church, or the man in the black suit. I stood up, still trying to process what had happened. Everything felt so real, but at the same time, so distant. I grabbed my backpack and walked toward the station exit, not knowing where to go. Still unable to make sense of what had happened, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. It was a text message. With trembling hands, I took out my phone and looked at the screen. It was from Lisa. "I'm fine. Don't worry. Don't come." The message left me frozen. What did all of this mean? It was like the train, the forest, the church, and that man in the black suit were part of a nightmare that I still couldn't understand. Had all of that actually happened? Or was I losing my mind? What was going on? But one thing was certain. That trip had changed something inside of me. Something that would never be the same again. Whether all of that was real or not, I can't say, but I would never forget any of it, that was for sure. I keep finding myself thinking about it all. Was it real? I was excited for that trip, a luxury cruise through the Caribbean, on one of the most famous ships in the world, full of entertainment, pools, parties. It was exactly what I needed after months of stress at work. When I bought the ticket, it seemed like the perfect idea. A whole week with nothing to worry about, just relaxing and enjoying myself. I arrived at the port on the morning of the departure, and the sight of the ship left me speechless. It was gigantic, a true floating city. Now I was really going to enjoy some well-deserved vacation time. The crowd of passengers moved towards the ship like a wave, everyone eager to start the adventure. I was among them, smiling, ready to forget the world for a few days. As soon as I boarded, I went straight to my cabin. I was impressed by the luxury and comfort. A big bed, a balcony with a sea view, and a fully stocked minibar. It felt like I was in a 5-star hotel, but in the middle of the ocean. After unpacking, I decided to explore the ship. It was even more impressive inside. There was a casino, several pools, themed bars, and restaurants serving everything from Italian food to sushi. People were everywhere, laughing, chatting, taking pictures. The atmosphere was pure fun. That night, I went to the main restaurant for dinner. The food was excellent, and the waiters were friendly. Afterwards, I decided to go to the upper deck to get some fresh air and see the sea at night. The sky was clear, full of stars, and the sound of the waves hitting the ship was relaxing. I really was in paradise. I was leaning on the railing, looking out at the dark sea when something caught my attention. Something in the water, far away, almost on the horizon. A shadow, large and dark, moving in the same direction as the ship. I watched it for a while, trying to figure out what it was, but I couldn't. Maybe it was a whale, or a school of large fish. I didn't think much of it and went back inside since the night was getting colder. Later, back in my cabin, I lay down in bed but couldn't fall asleep right away. I felt a slight unease, like something was out of place. The cabin was quiet, but there seemed to be a distant sound, almost inaudible. Something like whispers, coming from somewhere below me. I turned over in bed, trying to ignore it, and eventually, I fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling. It wasn't a dream. It was more like something had woken me up. I opened my eyes and noticed the cabin was colder than before, and that whispering sound was still there, only louder. I sat up in bed, trying to figure out where it was coming from. At first, it seemed to be coming from the walls, like the ship itself was murmuring. I got up and went to the door, opening it carefully. The hallway was deserted and silent, but as I stepped outside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I looked around but didn't see anyone. The hallway was dimly lit, and everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake off that feeling. I went back to the cabin and locked the door. That whispering sound continued, but now it seemed to be coming from inside my own head. I buried myself under the covers, trying to ignore it, but sleep didn't come easily. I spent the rest of the night awake, trying to understand what was happening. When the sun finally rose, I felt a little better. Maybe it was just exhaustion and anxiety about the trip that made me feel that way the night before. I convinced myself it was all just my imagination. I took a shower and went to have breakfast in the restaurant. The place was packed with happy people, talking, laughing, and the sense of normalcy calmed me down. I spent the morning exploring more of the ship, joining activities, and enjoying the pool. Everything seemed normal, and the weirdness of the previous night started to fade from my mind. I was beginning to relax and enjoy the trip. Around noon, I decided to take a walk on the lower deck, where there was an underwater observation area. It was a room with huge windows that allowed you to see the ocean floor. When I got there, the place was empty, which I thought was strange since it was one of the ship's tourist attractions. I entered the room and went straight to one of the windows. The ocean was a deep blue, and the sunlight penetrated the water, creating hypnotizing patterns. I stood there for a while, just enjoying the view, until something made me freeze. The shadow I had seen the night before was there, slowly moving through the ocean floor. But this time, it was closer, large and indistinct, as if something enormous was gliding under the water, right beneath the ship. Panic started rising inside me, but I couldn't look away. Suddenly, the floor vibrated slightly, as if something had collided with the ship's hull. It was a subtle impact, but enough to make me step back from the window. Whatever that thing was, it was right underneath us. Before I could do anything, the lights in the room flickered and went out for a few seconds. The darkness was complete, and the sound of my heartbeat was the only thing I could hear. When the lights came back on, the shadow was gone, but the sense of dread remained. I needed to get out of there. I ran out of the room, up the stairs quickly until I reached the main deck. The sun was shining, people were having fun, but to me, everything felt wrong. That shadow, that impact, something was definitely wrong with the ship. I decided I had to tell someone. I went to the reception and asked to speak to the captain or anyone responsible for security. They told me the captain was busy, but someone would come to see me soon. I waited for almost an hour, but no one showed up. Tired and frustrated, I went back to my cabin, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. That night, I lay in bed, but sleep didn't come. I kept tossing and turning, listening to the sound of the ship cutting through the water, but something felt off. Those whispers were back, louder and more persistent. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore them, but it felt like they were getting closer. Suddenly, the ship shook violently, as if it had collided with something again. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. I ran to the balcony of my cabin and looked out at the sea. The waters were rough, but there was nothing in sight. The ship kept swaying lightly, and the sound of the whispers was now so loud that I could barely hear my own thoughts. Then, out of the darkness of the ocean, something emerged from the water. A huge, indistinct figure, a shadow that shouldn't exist. It seemed to wrap around the ship, its grotesque outlines moving unnaturally. I stared, frozen with fear, as the thing disappeared back into the depths, leaving behind only the churning waves and the whispers growing louder. I was terrified, but one thing was clear. Something terrible was lurking on this cruise, and the feeling that I wouldn't make it out alive was becoming more real. The next morning, I went to the reception again, determined to talk to someone about what I had seen. But before I could say a word, a clerk handed me an envelope, saying it was from the captain. Inside was a brief, handwritten note. "Mr. John, the safety of the ship is our priority. Rest assured and enjoy the cruise. Sincerely, Captain Hawthorne." The note, instead of calming me down, made me even more uneasy. It felt like a polite way of telling me to keep quiet. I knew something was wrong, and now it seemed like they were trying to cover it up. Why didn't they want to hear me out? During the day, I tried to relax, but the events of the previous night wouldn't leave my mind. The shadow, the whispers, and that sense that something terrible was about to happen. The ship seemed normal, with activities and parties going on as if nothing was wrong, but I knew I wasn't imagining things. In the afternoon, I went back to the underwater observation room, this time determined to figure out what was going on. Once again, the room was empty. I approached the window, my heart racing, sweating nervously. The ocean looked calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. Then, something appeared in the darkness of the waters. At first, I thought it was just a reflection, a play of light and shadow caused by the ship's movement. But as I looked closer, I realized it was real. A human figure, or something that looked like a human, was floating, motionless, just below the surface. I moved closer to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure moved slowly, as if it was stuck to something, its arms gently floating in the water. It seemed to be upside down, with long hair drifting around its face. I couldn't make out the details, but I knew it wasn't normal. The water around the figure started bubbling, as if something was stirring beneath. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was pulled down, disappearing into the depths. I stepped back, feeling panic take over me. What had I just seen? Before I could react, the lights in the room began to flicker again, and that whispering sound returned, louder and more insistent. The vibration in the floor grew stronger, and suddenly, the ship lurched, throwing me against the wall. I heard a loud crack, like something was breaking apart, followed by muffled screams coming from above. The ship felt like it was falling apart around me, as if something was holding it and trying to pull it down into the ocean. I tried to get up, but the floor kept shaking violently. I managed to steady myself against the wall and started running toward the exit, fear driving me forward. I raced up the stairs, hearing the screams and the sound of metal creaking. When I reached the main deck, the sight was chaotic. People were panicking, running in all directions. Alarms were blaring, and the crew was trying to control the crowd. I looked around, trying to find a way out, but everything was a mess. The ship was tilting to one side, and seawater was starting to flood the lower deck. I knew I had to get out of there, but the feeling that something was watching, something monstrous and invisible, kept me frozen in place. Then I heard a voice next to me. It was a woman, a passenger who looked just as terrified as I was. "Did you see it? The thing in the water?" she asked, grabbing my arm tightly. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. She knew. She had seen it too. Before I could respond, the ship lurched again, throwing all of us to the side. The woman let out a scream as we fell to the ground. The water was now rising quickly, and the desperation of the people around us was palpable. That's when I looked over the edge of the ship, into the darkness of the ocean beyond, and saw something moving in the water. The same shadow, the same terrifying presence, was getting closer. It was huge, bigger than anything I'd ever seen, and it seemed to be waiting for us. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I knew, somehow, that this thing was connected to the ship, to the trip, to all of us. Something ancient, something evil, was rising from the depths to take us. I knew we didn't have much time. We had to get out of there. I grabbed the woman and ran toward the lifeboats, trying to ignore the screams and the sound of the ship tearing apart. The water kept rising, and with every step I took, the air around me felt heavier, harder to breathe. When we finally reached the lifeboats, it was pure chaos. The crew was trying to lower the boats, but many were already full, and people were pushing and fighting for a spot. The panic was total, and the sense of despair was suffocating. I managed to push the woman into one of the boats, but before I could get in, the ship lurched again. I was thrown backward, hitting the railing hard. When I got up, I saw that the lifeboat was already descending, filled with terrified passengers. I tried to run toward another boat, but the crowd was relentless. That's when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something rise from the water near the ship. The giant shadow was there, taking form, revealing something that wasn't of this world, something that shouldn't exist, and it was coming for us. Terror consumed me as I stared at that thing. I knew there was no escape. We were at the mercy of something beyond human understanding, something that had been awakened in the depths of the ocean, and now it was here to claim us. The ship was tilting dangerously to one side, and the waves were crashing hard against the hull, as if trying to swallow the vessel whole. I knew I needed to get out of there, but the sight of that thing in the water froze me with fear. I started running, with no direction, just trying to get away from that sound, that presence. I stumbled over debris and slipped on the water flooding the deck, but I kept going, my heart pounding like a drum. In the distance, I saw one of the last boats being lowered, still with a few empty seats. I ran toward the boat, but with every step I took, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, almost suffocating. The ship's lights began flickering again, and the sound of metal groaning got louder, as if the ship itself was screaming in pain. When I finally reached the boat, I looked back at the ship and saw the massive shadow rising once more from the depths, as if it was wrapping the ship in a deadly embrace. The waves around it started swirling, forming a whirlpool that was pulling everything down. The boat began to lower, but the fear inside me was uncontrollable. The sound of the whispers grew louder, and the feeling that something was about to happen became unbearable. I knew that if we didn't leave at that exact moment, we would all be pulled under along with the ship. Suddenly, the darkness around us seemed to deepen. Time seemed to slow down, and everything went silent. The whirlpool kept spinning, but the sounds of the crew, the passengers, and the ship in agony became muffled, as if we were trapped in a bubble of silence. That's when the figure in the water fully emerged, revealing a grotesque and indescribable form. Empty eyes, glowing with a sickly hue, stared directly at me, and in that moment, I knew there was no escape. But before I could react, the lifeboat was violently pulled under. We plunged into the water, and the feeling of being dragged into the depths enveloped me. The last thing I saw was the ship being consumed by the shadow, disappearing into the dark waters of the ocean, along with everyone still on board. And then, everything went black. I woke up on a beach, not knowing how I had survived. My body was exhausted, and my mind shattered. Whatever that thing was, it had let us live to tell the story. But I knew I would never be the same. I looked out to the horizon, at the calm yet treacherous ocean, and wondered if anyone would believe what I had seen. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter. The evil that lived in those waters couldn't be explained or understood. And somehow, I knew that one day, it would return to finish what it started. As I walked along the deserted beach, trying to find signs of civilization, one thing was clear. That cruise, that ship, was a journey into hell, and I was one of the few who had survived to tell the tale. I was about 10 years old when it all happened. It was summer, and my parents took me to spend the vacation at my grandma's house in rural Maine. Her house was surrounded by a dense forest, with trees so tall you could barely see the sky through the leaves. I loved that place. My cousins, Jake and Eric, were there too. Jake was the oldest, 12 years old, and Eric was my age. The three of us were inseparable whenever we were together. One afternoon, after a quick rain, we decided to explore the forest. Grandma always told us not to go too far, but you know how kids are. We love testing the limits. We packed some snacks in our backpacks and set off without telling anyone. We entered the forest with the sun still high, but it was always kind of dark in there. The trees were so thick that hardly any light came through. The ground was wet, and the smell of damp earth was strong. We walked for hours, laughing and running, imagining we were on some grand adventure. But the further we went, the weirder the forest felt. The trees started closing in, their twisted branches looking like the claws of a monster. I began to feel a chill down my spine, but I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to seem scared in front of my cousins. Jake was leading the way, always confident, but even he seemed a bit uneasy. Eric, who was usually the playful one, was way too quiet that day, almost like he knew what was coming. And that's when we realized we were lost. Night started to fall, and with it came a heavy darkness. We didn't have any flashlights, and the last bit of daylight was quickly disappearing through the trees. Fear started to set in. I tried to stay calm, but the forest felt different now, like it was alive and watching our every move. We tried retracing our steps, but everything looked the same. Every tree, every rock. There was no way to tell if we were going the right way or just getting even more lost. Jake started walking faster, and we followed him, trying not to think about what would happen if we couldn't find our way back. Then, we heard a strange noise, a sharp crack, like someone snapping branches. We froze, listening. The sound came again, louder this time, and it seemed to be coming from all around us. It felt like something was moving through the forest, but we couldn't see anything. Maybe it's just an animal, Jake said, but his voice was shaky. I knew he was trying to calm us down, but it wasn't working. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, we felt a presence. Something we couldn't see, but it was there. The air felt heavy, hard to breathe. A cold wind blew past us, and I got chills all over. And that's when we saw it. In the middle of the darkness, a tall, thin figure appeared. It was so tall it seemed to touch the tops of the trees. Its arms and legs were long and out of proportion, and its skin was pale, almost see-through. But the worst part was the face, or the lack of one. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, white surface. We froze, not knowing what to do. The thing didn't move, it just stood there, watching us. Or at least it seemed like it was. Without warning, the creature took a step toward us. Its movements were slow, but each step made the ground shake slightly. Jake was the first to react. He yelled for us to run, and that's what we did. We ran like we'd never run before, not daring to look back. The sound of the creature's footsteps echoed through the forest, getting closer and closer. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, my legs burning, but the fear was stronger than the exhaustion. We ran with no idea where we were going, just trying to get away from that thing. Branches tore at our clothes and scratched our skin, but the pain didn't matter compared to the terror of being caught. At one point, Eric tripped and fell. I stopped to help him up, but the creature was almost on us. Its long arms reached out like it was going to grab us. In a panic, Jake picked up a rock from the ground and threw it at the creature. The rock passed right through it, like it was made of smoke, and hit a tree behind it. That gave us just enough time to pull Eric up and keep running. We were exhausted, but the fear kept us going. Suddenly, we saw a small clearing up ahead. We ran toward it, hoping we could find our way out. When we reached the clearing, the sound of the footsteps stopped. I looked back, and the creature was standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. It was like the clearing was a boundary it couldn't cross. We stood there, panting, trying to process what had just happened. But we didn't have time to think. We heard a familiar sound, my grandma's dog barking. We ran toward the sound, and within minutes, we saw the lights of her house shining through the trees. When we finally reached it, we collapsed on the porch, out of breath. My grandma found us there, scared and exhausted. She hugged us and brought us inside, where we told her everything that happened. She listened quietly, but her eyes told us she knew something. When we finished, she simply told us never to go back to that part of the forest again. In the days that followed, we tried to forget what had happened, but that creature kept haunting our dreams. We never talked about it again, and we avoided the forest every time we visited Grandma. To this day, I don't know what that thing was. Maybe it was just a hallucination brought on by fear, or maybe it was something much older and more dangerous. All I know is that since that day, I've never been able to walk through a forest without feeling that chill down my spine, half expecting to see that tall, faceless figure again. And every time I visit that house, I make sure to stay as far away from the trees as possible. It was the summer before our senior year of high school. My friends and I decided we needed one last big adventure before we all started going our separate ways to different colleges or jobs. So, we planned a camping trip in a remote forest somewhere in northern Michigan. The idea sounded perfect. A few days disconnected from the world, just us, nature, and maybe some scary stories around the campfire. I loved that place. Beautiful, quiet, and above all, far from the hustle of New York. There were 3 of us, me, Mike, and Dave. We packed our tents, sleeping bags, canned food, and headed into the woods. The spot was gorgeous, surrounded by tall, dense trees, with a lake not far from where we set up camp. We arrived in the early afternoon, and after setting everything up, we decided to explore the area. The trail was well marked, but something felt off in the forest. Even with the sun still high, it seemed like darkness was more present than it should have been. The shadows of the trees were longer and denser, as if the forest was trying to hide something. At night, we lit a campfire. The flames danced, casting strange shadows around us. The cozy warmth of the fire and the distant sound of insects made us feel comfortable. We started telling scary stories, as any good camping trip should, but soon we sensed that something was watching us. Mike was the first to notice. He stopped mid-sentence, staring into the darkness between the trees. I asked what he saw, but he just shook his head, saying it was probably his imagination. But we all felt it. We weren't alone. After that night, things started to get weirder. The sounds of the forest, which had been comforting and familiar, began to feel different. The noise of insects and the rustling of leaves seemed more distant, almost muffled, as if we were in some kind of sound bubble. On the second night, after returning from a walk around the lake, we sat around the campfire again. This time, the atmosphere was heavier, as if something was watching us closely. I tried to ignore the discomfort, but it was impossible. Then we started hearing a sound. At first, it seemed like just the wind blowing through the trees, but soon it became clear that it was something more. A heavy sound, dragging through the leaves, was getting closer. We stopped talking and looked at each other, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound grew louder and closer, but we couldn't see anything beyond the shadows cast by the fire. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. We fell into complete silence, straining to hear anything that might indicate what was out there. The fire began to crackle strangely, as if it were running low on wood. But what truly terrified me was the smell. A strange metallic odor, like rusted iron mixed with rotten meat, filled the air. "Did you guys smell that?" I asked, trying to control the tremble in my voice. Mike and Dave nodded, both looking as scared as I felt. "Maybe it's a dead animal," Dave suggested, but even he seemed to know that wasn't true. We decided it would be best to go to sleep, thinking we might just be scaring ourselves for no reason. We crawled into our sleeping bags inside the tents, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside the tent felt amplified, like something was circling us. Around midnight, I woke up to a loud noise, like someone scratching the tent canvas. I lay still, heart racing, trying to understand what was happening. I heard Mike whisper my name from the other tent. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I replied, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Something's out there, man. It's not an animal. It's big." Fear began to turn into panic. I didn't know what to do. I stepped out of the tent and called for Dave, who was in the third tent. He came out, and we all stood there, trying to figure out what to do. We had no weapons, nothing to protect us from something we couldn't see. The sound returned. Something heavy was moving through the forest, slowly approaching us. This time, we could see a tall, misshapen shadow moving between the trees, but it seemed to be shrouded in a kind of mist, making it impossible to identify what it was. "Let's get out of here," Mike said, but there was nowhere to run. We were in the middle of the forest, surrounded by miles of trees and darkness. We decided to do what we could, hide in our tents and wait for it to leave. We went back inside and locked ourselves in as best as we could, but the thing outside had no intention of leaving us alone. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until we felt the tents being touched, as if it were investigating us, sensing our fear. The canvas of my tent sank inward, as if someone was pressing a heavy hand against it. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I stayed there, breath held, waiting for it to pass. Then the sound stopped. The presence seemed to have gone, but the fear remained. After a few minutes, I finally managed to breathe. I looked outside, and everything was quiet. Mike and Dave also emerged from their tents, all of us pale and scared. We didn't say anything, but we knew we needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. We decided that at dawn we would pack up camp and leave. But that night, no one could sleep. We sat in silence, listening for any sound that might indicate the presence had returned. Finally, the sun began to rise. The daylight brought some relief, but the fear was still there, buried in our hearts. Without wasting any time, we packed up camp and got out of there as fast as we could, not looking back. We never returned to that place, and to this day, I don't know what that thing was that chased us in the forest. But one thing is for sure, whatever it wasn't human, and it didn't want us there.